Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio, or you can add our RSS feed to your podcatcher of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter or Google+, with links on the site. And please give us feedback. Leave us a review on iTunes, tweet to us, send us an email, or leave us a message on Google+. I'd like to thank everybody who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. We are recording today on September 15th, 2015, and your hosts as usual are Tobias, Macey, and Patti. And today we are interviewing Griatch about the Evennia project. Griatch, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so hello, I'm Griatch. I'm a Swedish Pythonista, I suppose. I am a scientist by profession, an astronomer. And I use Python extensively at work, and that's the basic thing, I think.
That's great. How did you get introduced to Python?
Yeah, so as I said, I do research in astronomy, and I do computer modeling of astronomical objects. And in this, I tend to use Fortran, actually. And Fortran is a very powerful language. But it's not very pretty to look at, and it's not very useful in some ways, like string manipulation and things like that. So I was recommended to try out Python. This was maybe 10 years ago or so. And I sat down and learned Python over Christmas. And what I did to do that was basically I made a little choose-your-own-adventure text game in a terminal just to get the grips of the language. And I started using Python at work, and it turns out that Python interfaces brilliantly with Fortran. It's actually very, very nice and easy to interface the two. So these days I use Fortran for the heavy computing stuff, and Python for logics and disk I/O and things like that. So eventually, when I got into Evennia, it's a program created by a guy called Greg Taylor, and I took over development of that some 5 years ago.
And can you explain what MUDs are and what that has to do with Evennia?
Right. So a MUD is the abbreviation stands for multi-user dungeon or dimension maybe, but it's basically massive multiplayer text games. So these are forerunners to the MMORPGs of today. And in fact, these games used to be called graphical MUDs at some point before this MMORPG abbreviation came fashionable. And the basic principle of a text game or multiplayer text game is that you interact with a world in text. So you input usually commands via text, and you read descriptions of the environments and so on, and you do this together with other players as you would in any multiplayer game. A MUD is usually centered on role playing, but it can usually be. There can be many types of MUDs, from really action-packed, twitchy PvP type things to very loose rule shared storytelling experiences and things like that. So MUD in this respect is actually a really wide range of multiplayer text games, you could say. Evennia is a text game library. So it's game creation library and server in one, you could say. And you can use this to create your own MUD games or text-based multiplayer game in pure Python, which is the main basic premise of Evennia.
And what is it about MUDs that keeps them interesting long after the technical restrictions that led to their creation are no longer present, especially in light of the modern 3D multiplayer games like World of Warcraft and EVE Online?
Well, it's no secret, of course, that MUDs are not as prevalent as they used to be, right? I mean, The games like, as you say, EVE Online or WoW and so on. I mean, they are the what came after MUDs basically in the technological arena. And I mean, I love EVE Online, for example. So, but I should say that, I mean, I started playing text-based games in 2008, 9, something like that. So I don't play these games out of sentimentality. I mean, it's not like I, remember the good old days. I didn't play MUDs in their heyday. But I find that some things are, I mean, this is a personal opinion, of course, but I find that some things are just better in text than in graphics. I mean, there are some aspects like descriptions and making use of your imagination, and also freedom of role play. I mean, personally, I'm an old school role player. I game mastered many a game in all sorts of, and I made my own rule systems and played, paper and pen role playing. But over time, as you get older, people drift apart and move to different places, and I find it harder to get a group together and play a role playing game and stuff like that. So I looked around to see what you can do online, and of course you can do something like Roll20, where you have an actual role playing game. But apart from that, I would say that MUDs are basically the best role playing you can get online today. Simply because the text allows you so much freedom to interact in game, and also because of the depth you can produce when you don't have to create very heavy graphical assets. Also, from a development standpoint, they are, for you as a small dev team or hobby developer, for example, they require a lot less resources for you to create and make content, as I said, rather than having to make 3D assets or graphical assets and so on. So it means that these games tend to instead focus on complex gaming experiences. So you have deep role-playing systems, very deep interactions, and also interactions where you have role-playing in text, usually, of course, where you simply can't reproduce in a graphical sense, where you have to represent this with a graphical avatar of some sort. But in the text form, you can actually have a lot more freedom in this sense. So here you have a definite advantage over text games, in my view. And also, this is why many still play these types of games, despite the existence of games like WoW or EVE Online.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a testament to that as well is the fact that interactive text-based fiction games are still absolutely not just alive but thriving, and there's a whole competition around them, and it's a whole genre that hasn't been superseded simply because imagination is the best graphics engine that ever has or ever will exist, right?
Yeah, I mean, now the interactive fiction movement has really grown quite a lot. So this is sort of in parallel, you would say, to the multiplayer text game genre, which I'm here talking about. But you're certainly correct. I mean, the same way books are not going anywhere, even though there are films available or movies available. Text games are not going anywhere either, even though you could imagine they may be that the young generation are simply not maybe catching them quite as easily as you would game with flash graphics and so on.
And are MUDs, do they accommodate more of an asynchronous approach to gaming, allowing you to sort of interact with the game and then maybe focus on something else for a minute and then go back to the game, versus the more real-time characteristics of things like WoW or EVE Online?
I would say that this depends on the game. Text games are just as varied as graphical games in that respect. As I said, there are really text games that requires you to have really great reflexes. and you can't look away for a moment, or you will be brutally murdered or something. But then, of course, there are really games also that you have time to write, really careful entries where you describe what your character do with a lot of text, and really you can really take the inner author in yourself, and then the turn, so to speak, or the flow of the game is much slower. And you're right, then there are really people who like play the same game and then they take it on different computers or tablets or something and take it with them and play the same thing without stopping, so to speak. So you can really have a very long experience and have a very different type of gaming experience if you choose that type of game.
I was going to say, I've seen everything from real-time space battles involving firing photon torpedoes to turn-based games that require real-time interaction, to games like Boggle and the like, where people might play a lazy game over the course of a day, taking a turn only every 5 or 10, 15, 20 minutes when they have a moment to focus on it.
Yeah, so it depends very much on what the type of gameplay and style and mood. So I mean, in some gaming communities, it tends to be a community, right? In many of these games, there are various types of ways to go about this, and the quality of text you should write or not, depending on the type of game.
And can you dig into a little bit the mechanisms used for analyzing and responding to the textual input that people use for interacting with the game, or sort of how the text is transformed into something meaningful to the game engine?
In the sense of, are you asking for the technical description how we do it in Evennia, or are you asking in a general sense on how it's done in general from the user's perspective?
I guess a bit of both, whatever you feel more comfortable addressing.
Okay, so basically, as in any game, you are inputting commands into the game. In a graphical game, these commands might be mouse clicks or joystick movements or something like that. In a text game, it could be something like that, but in principle, usually it's handled by you entering text commands. So this could be you moving around, and this is also an interesting aspect, because when you have text, it's harder, and this is the drawback of text, it's harder to visualize room placement, so spatial information. This is a natural thing when you have graphics to see where you are in a room, whereas in text this is actually quite a problem, because you say you're in a room, but it can be require quite a lot of text if you really require detailed information of where the enemy is, for example, relative to you, if you are turned in the right direction or not. So usually the traditional way to handle this is actually to abstract this. So you have the room is sort of a location, it's the name for a general location, and when you move, you're actually moving between these abstract locations, these abstract rooms, traditionally by just north, south, east, west directions. And this is commands that you enter, and then you get a description of the location you're in, and that description usually includes things you can interact with in that room. For example, other players, or objects, or monsters, or whatever. And then you can, via commands, you can, for example, you can enter or look at monster, or look at troll, or look at that cool player over there, or whatever. And you will get more information about that. And notably, you can describe what your character is doing, for example. So you can describe in text that your character is standing around in this room, smoking a cigarette, or if it's a fantasy game, maybe fiddling with their pet dragon or something. And other players will see this and interact with you. Or if it's a more PvP experience, you might draw your swords and attack each other. And it's all handled in commands. So from the server's perspective, from the game server, like Evennia's perspective, what's coming in is text, and it's up to the parser to parse this text to identify it as a command that the server understands and the game understands, and then spit back out some sort of response to this. So in more modern servers like Evennia, there are also other types of input coming from the game client, and that is things which are not directly related to the text written sort of on the input line, but there could be other things going back and forth between the client, like updating a health bar or varying dynamic things that doesn't require the direct input of the player. So, and also of course the server will inform the player gradually if something changes without their input, of course, like weather changing in the room or night setting and various players coming and going or other things happening.
So can you give us a rundown of the various parts of Evennia, like the MUD engine, web interface, etc., and how they fit together?
Right, so I think it's probably the easiest if I just briefly show what you will see when you have a new Evennia install as a new wannabe MUD developer. So first of all, so once you have installed Evennia, so Evennia is a game library. So you install it from our GitHub page, but we recommend that you install it in a virtual environment, and then you just use pip to install it in there. And then you will have the Evennia command program available in your shell, in your bash shell or whatever. And so what you do then is that you run Evennia init, and that creates your own game folder. So that could be named whatever you want for your game. And that game folder has a range of empty templates, so Python templates, and they're basically Python modules with some instructions and empty classes for various game objects in there. You don't need to touch that initially, it's all set up to run. So you use Evennia, again the program Evennia migrate, and that creates the database for your game. By default, this is a SQLite 3 database, but since we are running off Django, you can actually use a wide range of different SQL databases. And finally, you do Evennia start, and then your game is running. So you have a fully functioning online game. And that includes a web server. So you can, at that point, you can go in your browser, you can connect to localhost on the port 8000, and you will have a nice default website for your game. And you can click a button there and have a HTML5 web client to log into your game. And you can, of course, also use the traditional telnet clients that have been available for many a year. So this is the traditional third-party clients you can also connect your game with. So at that point you have a fully functioning game. It's very empty though, but it's working fine for interacting with other players, chatting, things like that.
Running
so Evennia,
tutorial.
Sorry?
I was going to say you can run through the tutorial, etc., etc.
Right, yeah, you can run. There is a tutorial world you can install with a single command, and also out of the box, Evennia has some 90 commands, I think it is, which are like mostly admin commands, like things like administrating the server, kicking players, creating new objects. So build some basic building and administration commands, which are which most games will need, but they're pretty dull to implement if you are starting out. So you can, a lot of basic but useful commands are available. What Evennia does not include by default are game systems that are unique for every game anyway. So like combat, character creation, races, skills, things like that, because we expect our users to want to make these things unique to their particular games. This is our target group, so to speak. Generally, our people, the developers coming to Evennia are keen on making their dream games, and that is usually very custom, and so we don't impose any of these game-specific stuff. However, we do include with the distribution a contribution folder, which has more game-specific things like dice rollers, barter system, examples of menus, how to have menu systems, and various tutorial worlds and systems like that. So these are just optional plugins, so you just import that and use it in your game however you want. So this is mainly my stuff at the moment, but we are open for more people to contribute stuff to the contribute folder for everyone to use. So once you have this, so now you have a running game, but very empty. So what you have now is that the ability to put your own Python modules in your newly created game directory. And so Evennia is completely coded in Python modules, so outside the game. So we follow the principle that you're better off as a developer today in modern days to use your own professional text editor with professional version control or whatever you want to put on your game design. So rather than the traditional way of many mods to code these things in some sort of internal language in the game. So Evennia, the basic working of Evennia is to tell Evennia to import your modules like normal Python modules, and then you execute them. So this makes it easy to make very custom games, because of course you have access to all the Python modules out there in the wild and can use them directly to whatever functionality you want in your game. So you're not just depending on us producing stuff for you.
That's great. How does Evennia handle the fact that the mud world is comprised of many hundreds of objects containing various properties, maintaining consistent, persistent state as players interact with them?
Right. So Django is what we use for the database backend of Evennia. Django is perhaps most known as a web framework, and we also use it as that. So Django is what is make it very easy for us to present our own website, for example, tied to the same database as the game itself. But Django also has a very stable ORM, so for interacting with databases. So we use that. In actuality, as I said, there are lots of objects in the mud world, and many of these are very different from each other. So one way you could imagine doing this would be to make different SQL database tables for, I don't know, say a chair or a stool or a person or something like that, and keep adding new custom database tables, or say Django models, which is the Python representation of this in Django. And that would be pretty catastrophic in the long run and very hard to maintain. So Evennia does this by using very few actual database tables or Django models. And these base models, so we only have, I think it's 4 core models, and that is the object, the player, and then there are some also for inline communication, like scripts and channels. And I won't go into there's a difference between player and character in Evennia. You have the player is the account which you connect to the game with, and the character is actually like any object. You're puppeting. As a player, you're puppeting a character.
So I, as a player, could have multiple characters in multiple role-playing systems, even in the same MUD if I wanted to, if the MUD supported it.
If the MUD chose to implement such a thing, yes, you could have the same account or same player account. So the player has your password, and stuff like that. But you can connect. Evennia supports a lot of different modes in this. So you can in the most generous mode, you can actually connect to your player account and control multiple characters with multiple connections. So this is actually something requested by users that we add this. So you have the ability, for example, to play the same character from different computers at the same time, and also some multiple characters at the same time. Apparently, there are really game communities where this is common. But anyway, so we have very few database tables, and Evennia uses a Python class, which we call a type class, but it's basically a Python class that saves itself to the database behind the scenes. And it means that you, as a developer, you create a class and create an instance of that class. And when you create an instance of that class, that is actually saved to the database for you. You never need to actually deal with the database aspect of this. So to take an example of this, let's say we want to create a particular type of object called a car, so a weaponized car. I recently saw Mad Max. And so how do you do that? So in Evennia, what you would do is that you would use you would make a new child class, a new Python class inheriting from the base object class of Evennia. So this is really like in your code, you just do import Evennia, and then you inherit from Evennia.object, basically, or default object. And you call this new class Mad Max car, say. And this now has everything under the hood. It's using meta classes and other things under the hood, but you don't need to know about this. You put helper methods on it, whatever you need to do to represent, what you think of a Mad Max car, how it should be. Evennia offers attributes, which are special database models or objects that you just attach as properties on this class. So, for example, you could have health or armor or speed. So this is just creating a foreign key relationship behind the scenes for you, and allow you to customize your Mad Max car as much as you want to make it, specific to what this particular object should be able to do. And then you can do, in this case, a car is a pretty complex thing. You will want to be able to drive it. You might have weapons on it, so you can fire the gun or launch missiles or something like that. So, as I said, all the input from the player are commands. And in Evennia, commands are also classes. And they are so all the commands that are available to you, none of that is hard-coded in the engine. It's all freely available to you to modify as you see fit. And so the normal commands like look or get or drop they are basically just command objects stored on your character. Or in the case of admin commands, they might be stored on your player account object to make them available. So in this case, we create some new commands, inheriting from the command class of Evennia. So from Evennia import command and inherit from that. And then you just store, so for example, we make a command fire or launch missiles or something like that. And in that class we define what happens when you do that. And then you store those commands on the Mad Max car and set some permissions on it to make sure that these are only available to objects inside the car. And you might also want movement commands, so like, you know, move around or move to the next room or I don't know, honk the horn, whatever. And so in the games, then now you have created a Python class, a Python module with these classes available. Now you just log into your game and create a new object of the type Mad Max car. So you just use the create command, which comes with Evennia, which you could also in principle recreate or change as you want. It's just a command like any other. And you give the dot path to the class, to that command, basically. So you give the, pointing to the Mad Max car class. And boom, then you have a new car, a new Mad Max car in the room. And it has all the functionality of that you have coded for it. And if you did errors, then you will see a nice traceback. This will not crash the server normally, but you can just fix your code and just reload the code right in there.
So that's really interesting. So basically, unlike traditional MUD systems where builders or even programmers to use like mucks or moos or things like that, the programming is all done outside of the MUD environment. You're actually programming Python in your MUD execution environment to create new classes of things in world.
Yeah. So we basically and the nice thing with this is that as you create this car, it's also now stored in the database because it's an instance of the class. So it's all created in the database, and you can shut down the server or whatever, and the car will still be there. And so now you just step into the car and can use all the commands and so on in it and drive around with it and so on. But yes, you're quite correct. Normally, in many traditional sort of game systems, there is a mini language or usually a custom sort of language where you can build these things in game. Evennia does not prohibit this. I mean, you could have, for example, you could make a generic object, say, and allow you and create a slew of build commands for builders to use to populate that object, say, with names and various functionality and so on. So you could make what is equivalent to an in-game coding environment, or at least a very, very powerful build environment in-game if you wanted to. We don't aim for that out of the box, though, because we feel like if you sit here and you're coding, you're better off actually using a proper text editor and version control and all the code help and functionality that is available to you when you're dealing with proper Python modules, rather than us having some sort of in-game system that is sort of another high-level language on top of Python.
Absolutely. And in this day and age with disposable servers, it's not like it used to be where giving someone a count on your box to SSH into and work on the MUD is not the investment that it used to be, right? So
no, I mean what we recommend is that people, I mean, even if a development team wants to keep their stuff secret or something, I mean, there are free repositories on Bitbucket, for example, which you can use. So everyone, I mean, Evennia works in such a way so that all the developers of your game can just pull down the current state and run their own debugging server on their own and push stuff then to the central repository then that you as the game owner or the group that is running the game can then just accept. I mean, a normal professional game development or programming workflow. So I think the advantages of having an in-game coding environment, I mean that is not having to give up access, but that has diminished that advantage. And today I think you are better off actually making use of modern technology.
So what concurrency tools or paradigms does Evennia use?
So all the networking of Evennia is done using Twisted. So Twisted is an asynchronous network framework, so this is the core sort of game loop of Evennia. So Twisted is a way to allow asynchronicity in the same game process. So Evennia is all running in one process. There's no threading needed in that sense, so this bypasses the problem that Python has with the DOM.
The GIL?
The GIL, yeah, the lock of the interpreter lock, global interpreter lock, and so instead of doing that, Twisted basically, you could say, chops up the execution of Python code into small snippets and execute them very rapidly and very efficiently. So the effect of this is that we get concurrency, and all the users can work together without waiting on each other, but we don't have the problems of threading. And to be fair, a text server is not that heavily demanding in the sense of a game. So this generally works very well, unless you scale up the user base to thousands of players. But Evennia supports a large range of players, and we have tested it quite extensively in this. It's very efficient. Also, Twisted offers some easy ways to make connection protocols. I mean, Twisted is a very extensive library. So for example, it was pretty easy for us to implement Telnet, which is the traditional MUD interface, and also the various MUD extensions to Telnet that has evolved organically over the years. But we also have, through Twisted, we can also support WebSocket, SSH, SSL. And since the web server, which is a Twisted web server, runs in the same process, you can actually easily link your Django website to the same database without any worries of caching conflicts and things like that. Yeah, and also through Twisted, you have a very nice way to interact with the web clients, our own web client, for example.
In a way, Evennia is kind of the ultimate realization of what Glyph originally wrote Twisted for, right?
Yeah, he was quite excited when he heard that someone actually used Twisted for a MUD style thing. I mean, he as you say, he originally had ideas for using it for a MUD. So yeah, he was quite intrigued by the fact that it was actually being used for that.
So during the height of MUD's popularity, one highly sought-after feature was the idea of being able to have players travel from one MUD instance to another. Would it be possible to implement this in Evennia?
Yeah, this question pops up now and then. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical about the practical use of it. But, I mean, you have issues like translating a character between game systems. For example, how do you do that? You need some sort of custom translation table and agreements between the MUDs and so on. But if you wanted that, really, I guess it would be possible. You would need to set up some sort of custom protocol to do it. Evennia already links with external resources. I mean, you can do that rather easily. But no, there is no. You can't specifically travel between MUDs in that sense. As I said, it's possible to do, but I don't think it's worth it, to be honest.
Right. I had a couple of acquaintances who actually did this once with old school muds, but by the time they did, they had kind of felt like the majority of the mud world had shriveled up to a point where nobody cared. So it was kind of like it was such a big deal in its time, and now I tend to agree with you. I kind of don't see it being worth the effort either. But
Yeah,
interesting.
I think it dilutes. I mean, it's just as well to create two accounts. It's so easy to do. So you can just as well play both worlds, both games, and be happy doing that than having to synthetically move between them somehow. I mean, I guess if you have two sibling games that have very similar worlds or share the same world maybe and things like that, but it's so much easier to just create two separate accounts and run the
Right.
things. So, yeah.
And so we've talked a bunch about how interaction between different elements of the game happens, but how do you sort of describe and update and maintain the overarching narrative of the mud environment? How does the storyline of the game translated within the overall game environment? So what elements of Evennia or what elements of the mud drive the storytelling element of the overall interaction?
Well, as far as Evennia is concerned, there is no out of the box gameplay, and there is no narrative in that respect. I know that different traditional mud games do this in different ways. So some have a big staff that is running the meta game or the overall narrative of the world and what's happening and big events going on. I mean, and whereas others let it be more of a player-driven, sort of gradually evolving open sandbox kind of thing. I think it's the same principle that you would use in a graphical game. That's no difference. It's just different in the type of discussion, the type of stories, and the detail, I think, of the stories that can be created. But the basic principles are not different from MMORPGs game.
Yeah, so you can do like what Grouch was just saying, that there are plenty of cases where you basically just provide a framework for people to kind of open role play in, and there are other cases like what you're saying, Tobias, where it's kind of more like moving through an interactive fiction story where there is a consistent narrative and you're interacting with the mud in various concrete ways as you move through a story, quests to solve, etc. And
I mean, you should remember that the mud, like the World of Warcraft quest chain kind of thing. I mean, this is all originally created in muds. So the whole principle of questing and stuff like that, and instances and all of this this comes from the text world and was refined maybe in the professional, in the graphical game world, but all the same things work the same. You could apply the same things in principle if you wanted to have a more game-driven or world-driven experience, or like quest or things like that. So that would be basically the same thing, just with different graphics or lack of graphics in a sense.
So how would that work, though, to sort of expand on Tobias's question just a little bit? Let's say you have a quest where you have to uncover a key. You have to solve a particular puzzle to gain access to a key, which is then used to unlock a crypt, wherein you encounter some next part of the game, whether it's you meet an NPC that you either have to kill or work with to enable some further, part of the puzzle or something like that. How does that kind of programmatic interaction in various parts of the world work?
Yeah.
As an
So
example.
right. So an example of this is used in the tutorial actually for Evennia, and there you have an example where you're looking for, it's a small adventure or test example game where you are looking for a particular crypt that is containing a magical weapon. And to get into that crypt, you have to look at an object elsewhere in the world, and that object is actually a custom object. And every time you look at it, it shows a different scene. It's like an obelisk that shows magical scenes on it. and that scene you happen to see is the crypt, describes the fresco on the crypt you have to go into. Because if you pick the wrong crypt, it's going to be a trap, and you sort of get whisked off. It's only, and so you need to. How that works programmatically is that every time you look at the object, this obelisk, the object identifies that it's being looked at, and it is basically a hook. So your look command triggers a hook on the object it's looking at. So that's simply the command has a call to the target of the look, and it calls a hook on that one called @look simply. And the obelisk responds, aha, this thing is looking at me. So what I do then? Okay, I check. This is a character looking at me. Now I store a simple little flag, in this case, on that object, listing exactly what that character saw. So which scene I happened to randomly show when they looked. And then when they eventually get to the crypt, and gets to choose between a range of crypts, they go into one of these exits, and the exit itself checks this flag, or it's not actual flag, it's actually an actual identifier on the character, and if that matches the exit they chose, then okay, they went to the right one, and they are happy and find good stuff. Otherwise, they are whisked off to horror and death and stuff. So that's one way to do it. I mean, there are many other ways to do it. You could use Evennia's lock system, for example, to lock down a door unless you carry a particular object, like a key. Or you could actually implement custom commands on the key to make sure that you have to, put it in the door and turn the key which is usually kind of annoying to have to do, but you couldn't do that if you wanted to.
That's great. That's what I was curious about, is just to get kind of an example to sort of show people how that would fit together.
Yeah, I mean, there is another example in the tutorial with a wall, which is actually a particular exit, and that wall has a range of like hanging roots from it, and the wall presents a range of custom commands that are only available to you when you stand in front of the wall, and that allows you to move these roots around on the wall. It's a very simple little puzzle. So you basically move them aside, and then there is a button appearing, which you see in the middle of the wall when you move away the roots, and then suddenly when that's available, then there's a button or press button command available to you, and you press that, and the door and the exit opens, and you can walk out. So you can do a lot of powerful things when you have the full power of Python available to you in your in-game command objects and commands.
Has the Evennia core team given any thought to adding features to support a richer client interaction, like graphical maps or the like?
So through the WebSocket protocol, we do support our own HTML client, which is a JavaScript web client. And this can not only receive text, but it can also receive any custom instruction sent from or to the server from Evennia. And it actually, the same thing can be said about Telnet, because these days modern third-party MUD clients actually has a lot of extensions to the Telnet protocol to do the same thing. But in our web client's case, we use JSON for that type of communication. And this is called out-of-band communication, and that's used to do things without the user's direct input. So you can update health bars, maybe have a window with the inventory, or maybe even a little graphic of your character with what they wear, for example. You could definitely have maps potentially, but there are none I know of in the works at the moment. But you could do stuff like that. Many of these things are relatively game specific, you could imagine, but Yeah, we should probably also supply stuff to extend the web client. Since we control the web client, we have more flexibility there, so we should probably do more with that. Also, our existing web client is soonish to get an update, so we hope to make it a little bit easier to plug in your own functionality as various JavaScript plugins and easily receive data back and forth from Evennia that way.
And how difficult would it be to use Evennia to interface with something like Slack or HipChat for a company-wide MUD? And have you ever heard of somebody doing something like that?
So I haven't looked into Slack or HipChat, but Evennia already interfaces with IRC, for example. So you can chat to. So, for example, even though you're in game, you can chat to people sitting in the IRC channel. We'll do this all the time in the development and support channel of Evennia. So new development games, they connect their own development games with the support channel, so they can literally chat with us directly from inside game.
That is really cool.
And it's very. This is something which is actually quite easy to set up via Twisted, because Twisted support have IRC protocols. So we run that, and also Twitter, for example, you can easily set up. We have instructions of how to run a Twitter command. So you just enter a command in game, and it tweets to your preset Twitter account, whatever you want to do, to like updates for your game world or what happens there. So these things are fully functioning as it is, but so I don't think it would be too hard to write an Evennia protocol for something like Slack or HipChat as well. Maybe you would need to be a little bit careful if you want to have control from the other side, like being able to input commands or something that you would need to somehow make sure that it's secure. But I would not be surprised if there are already fully functioning protocols for Twisted, or at least for Python for these chat systems. So
there's I can see already there's a Python-Slack real-time module that interfaces Twisted with the Slack REST API.
Yeah, there you go. So probably you could just slot that in, and as with most other things, Evennia's protocol systems are also completely pluggable. So you can plug in your own systems like that without touching the core library of Evennia. So you could, in principle, add this. But if you do, please contribute it so we can all enjoy it.
All right. And you mentioning Twitter raises an interesting possibility as well of maybe having a MUD instance that anybody on Twitter can interact with by tweeting at a particular user account, and that just raises some interesting ideas.
I think there are a lot of possibilities here, which are still pretty unexplored. I mean, in the sense of, one of the things with Evennia is that we are using Django, right? So that makes it very powerful to make a web environment or a web experience parallel to the game, because it's the same database. They use the same the game and the website uses the same database. So you could, for example, a very basic example is, of course, to be able to see how many people are in the game from the website. But you can also potentially do stuff like logging in, do character creation, maybe set up meetings with people. There are lots of good ideas you could do with this kind of thing, and that's just staying within the web server. Then we're not even talking about, as I said, tweeting or doing stuff.
Or even creating a marketplace between characters in the game so that different players can potentially trade inventory items via the web interface.
Yeah, any multiplayer game thrives on its community. So I think this is true for text games the same way as it is for graphical games, and I think that all of these things, and also of course that might help also for beginners to get into the game a little bit more and so on. So Yeah, so there are lots of possibilities here, and I should say this is not. I mean, there are of course mud games that use the web extensively. I mean, existing mud games. So Evennia is not at all unique with this possibility, but it's out of the box doing it, and that's and it's also using very modern ways to do it. So I think in that sense we are trying to make it easier for people to do this without having to hack things together themselves.
Well, that's exactly it, and that's one of the reasons I so very much wanted to talk to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Is traditionally MUDs, because they were written a while ago, are these really kind of dense C or C++ code bases using things like like Berkeley DB or other binary file system based databases as their persistence layer. And if you've ever read MUD source code, it can get pretty dense and pretty intense. It's not for the faint of heart.
Many of the most used systems actually don't even use a database, but they use flat files.
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And
and as you say, I mean, they are many of them are relatively old, or quite old actually, and written in C, C++, and have grown in many cases quite organically over and changed hands many times and so on. So yeah, it requires quite a lot of work in many cases to run them. Is my impression.
Right. So could you extend a more traditional MUD to interface with HipChat or Slack or Twitter or whatever the case may be? Yes, you absolutely could. And in the case of the more programmable ones like Moo, for instance, people have done much those same kinds of things.
People do remarkable things in softcode, in like in a Mush or in Moo. I mean, it's really remarkable stuff
absolutely.
They do.
But what's amazing, what I think makes Evennia really noteworthy, is the fact that you don't have to learn an incredibly arcane programming language that's intrinsic to the MUD in order to be able to do that. If you know Python and you have access to all these APIs and you can just call them unmodified. So I think the ease with which you can create these integrations or make your own custom modifications is really kind of groundbreaking and very cool.
So we actually have quite a lot of new developers, or at least wannabe developers, coming and talking to us in our community or development community of Evennia, and it's actually quite a considerable fraction which are completely new to Python, and in some cases completely new to programming overall, and but they just always wanted to make a game. And text gaming, I mean, even if some really wanted to have played MUDs and really wanted to make the MUD that was better than the one they played, but some are really just wanting to make a game. And in that respect, also if you are completely newbie, the text is actually very useful to you, because as I said, it's much easier and cheaper to do resources and do content for a game in that sense. It's still a lot of work. I mean, there's no denying that in any game engine. I mean, it's taken a lot of work to make a multiplayer game, text or graphics or not, but it's still, in that sense, a slightly lower threshold, and also text tends to allow you, is my impression in a way, to focus more on the core game experience. It's called the core game systems rather than the flashy, because there's no flash beyond how your process.
Absolutely. When I first heard about Evennia and I had gotten you to agree to come talk on the show, I actually posted a link to the project to a Facebook alumni group for this MUD that we've all been talking on for the last 15 years. And a lot of the dinos, which is MUD terminology for people who've been around for a really long time, were really excited. And a couple of them even said, I've long said that Python would be an incredible teaching tool. And when exactly what you said, when you think of a MUD as something that's really a really exciting thing for a new programmer to be able to build, like, hey, you can go create this multi-user interactive game, that gets people really excited about programming. It's a lot better than something dry like, I don't know, here, construct this sort algorithm or something like that. It gets people excited.
Yeah, I mean, the core principle of Evennia is to remove all this boring, networking stuff, database processing, all the stuff that every game needs. But if you're going to start to do that from scratch, all your enthusiasm is, I mean, unless you're really, really keen on doing these things from scratch, it will drain your enthusiasm quite quickly. So the whole idea here is that we handle all this for you and try to actually hide away much of the... I mean, you don't actually need to know Twisted, for example, to run Evennia, or Django for that matter. You can dive into the depth, into the metal if you really want and really know what you're doing. So there's no blocking or anything, but you could in principle code everything using basic Python primitives, classes and functions. And we find that, as you say, this is actually potentially quite useful also for beginners or just trying to get into Python in general or coding in general. And we really get all kinds of people in our support chat from everything from really old timers who have played MUDs for 20 years to people who have just heard about MUDs and thought it sounded cool and just want to try to make a game. So, and we have, I should maybe flag a little bit. We have quite extensive documentation, which is also relatively unusual for MUDs in the MUD world or in the text-based world. So we have our Wikipedia on GitHub is considered, at least I've heard by others, to be pretty extensive and a lot of tutorials and information. So that's also helping, of course, people to sort of get going, hopefully.
So are there any fully fledged running MUDs built with Evennia out there in the wild that people can look at?
So at this point, I'm not aware of a fully running sort of production level game. There are a considerable amount of games in development, some of which are actually uses paid coders, which is a big deal. So they are hopefully, so I think the most promising ones I see are going to launch sometime in the beginning of next year, but overall there are a large number of projects in the works, but none that I know that are in full production. We have actually initialized our own sort of gaming project called Eineve, which is meant to serve as a breeding ground for all these various code systems that could help to people who want a little bit more code to work from than the relatively bare bones game that the core Evennia offers. But that's a project that is ongoing.
That's great. And one last thing, are there any areas in particular in your project that you would like to welcome the community to contribute to, areas that you could use some help?
So, I should really be mentioning the community in general, because of course we have lots of people who are involved in working on Evennia, and many have contributed a lot. In my case, I'm fine that I am not really that much of a web developer. I'm more of a core coder in that sense. So people helping with things like the interface of a default client, or following proper web standards in the files and so on. That's something which is highly appreciated, and I have gotten some good help with this, but I could really need more input from web developers and people skilled with the use of proper modern techniques and so on in creating web pages and so on. So that's certainly a point which I recognize my my own sort of lack of experience.
And so are there any questions that we didn't ask you that you think we should have, or any topics that you wanted to bring up before we move to the picks?
Well, yeah, no, so it's interesting because as me personally, I mean, I've coded quite a lot in professionally. But I must say that, at least for me personally, coding something like Evennia is actually very useful for me as well, also for helping my own programming skills. Because you're making code that is intended to be read by others. That is a very, very useful exercise. And I mean, we have really tried hard to make Evennia as PEP 8 compliant as possible. We have comments on every function and class and so on and so on. So we really tried hard to make the core of Evennia as well documented and readable as possible. And this is, I can really recommend this for anyone who wants to improve their coding skills, just to make something that you expect others to look at and try to understand. So because I mean this is all critical for something like Evennia, where you have the developers are supposed to look at your code and figure out how things hang together. And it also helps a lot for trying to not having to spend all time explaining verbally what you actually were thinking when people want to use your system. So that's actually something which I really want to flag for people to consider, to make something that people are intended to actually read and understand. So that's been very useful for me personally and professionally to do that.
So I guess with that, we'll move on to our picks. I'll start us off. So the first pick is one that I actually found today called libraries.io, and it's a way for you to keep track of the various open source libraries that you either just want to stay up to date with or ones that you use in your projects, and it will actually let you know when there are new releases for those different libraries. So, for instance, it would be a good way to upload or track all the libraries that you're using in your requirements.txt for a given project and get alerts whenever one of those dependencies has an upgrade. My next pick is the JSON API spec. It's a very good spec that has a decent middle ground of good structure while also remaining flexible. So definitely worth checking out at jasonapi.org. And along with that, there's the Marshmallow marshalling library for Python that makes it really easy to create class instances that can have particular methods that will do various mutations or for serializing or deserializing your objects. So it makes it very easy to create an interface for a specific API. So that is it for me today. Chris, what have you got?
So my first pick is the latest John Scalzi book in the Old Man's War series, which I really enjoy. It's good, entertaining science fiction. This book is called The End of All Things. If you like science fiction and you like science fiction with a wry sense of humor, you should definitely be reading this series. My next pick is a thing from a maker of teas and purveyor of teas called David's Tea, which just recently came into the Boston area. I guess it's a Canadian chain, but you can buy their stuff online too. And they make this incredible tea steeper. It's this plastic, BPA-free plastic thing. I don't quite know how to phrase it. That fits over your teacup or mug or whatever or glass. And it can be used for making hot tea. You put loose tea in the top and then pour your water in. And there's like a little strainer that works when you lift the thing up. It's a really clever mechanism. So you can sit it on your glass and let it steep. And then when you're ready for it to pour, you lift up and the stopper moves automatically, and the tea goes through a filter. The water goes through a filter, so you don't get any of the grounds. And the other amazing little thing about this is that it's equally awesome at making iced tea with your own tea on the fly. So if you're like me and you drink a lot of different herbal teas, you can make an awesome glass of herbal iced tea with no muss, no fuss, just as easy as you would a glass of hot tea in a matter of a couple of minutes. It is delightful. My third pick is Tracy Osborne, who we had here on the show previously, Lime Darling on Twitter, is doing a Kickstarter right now for a sequel book to her awesome Hello Web App book on learning the beginnings of Django for people who are not familiar with programming or web programming. I've been programming for years, but I still have not been able to wrap my brain around web programming, and Hello Web App is the closest I've come thus far. I really loved this book. It is like it does not, it is very concise. It says exactly what you need it to say and does not take you on all kinds of tangents. It's just incredible. And she's doing a Kickstarter for a sequel to that called Hello Web App Intermediate Concepts. I'm really excited. I backed the project, and so should you, because she's a great author and she does a lot for the community and she's doing great work. And that's about it for me. Griatch, what do you have for us?
Well, when it comes to Python modules, I guess I should. I doubt there are that many people who are using Fortran in this user group, but the F2Py library or module is actually something I recommend. If you ever want to deal with Fortran, this is the thing to do it and use it from Python. Also, to stick with the theme here, there's a book, and if you are into text gaming or any sort of world design, you'll probably know this one, but there is a book called Designing Virtual Worlds by Richard Bartle. So this is really something I recommend if you're at all interested in creating your own games. It doesn't necessarily have to be Mud, even though Richard Bartle is one of the co-creators of the original game Mud. But this is really a lot of interesting stuff for anyone interested in creating an online world, or virtual world of any form. It's a lot of inspiration to have there. And finally, why not take a peek at the various places that are dealing with MUDs out in the wild. So there is, for example, a place called Imaginary Realities, which is an e-sign on MUD design. And there's also something called Optional Realities, which is a MUD development forum, which is relatively recently started. And I say it because it started by one of the people who are developing a game in Evennia, so I'm familiar with it. There are plenty of other MUD-related forums out there, but I guess I should make a shout out, or people will wonder why I didn't mention them.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and for anybody who wants to keep track of what you are up to and what is happening with the Evennia project, what would be the best way for them to do that?
So the Evennia.com website has feeds from all the various aspects of Evennia, so including my dev blog, the latest forum discussions, and updates in the code and issues and so on. Otherwise, the code itself is available via GitHub, the Evennia repository on GitHub. So yeah, and also of course we are on IRC on the Evennia at the Freenode IRC network. So drop in and say hi. There's usually people around.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy listening to this episode, and we appreciate you coming on the show, so hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
No problem, thank you.